Our first reading is from Genesis chapter 27, verses 1 through 45. Listen for God's word. When Isaac was old and his eyes were dim, so that he could not see, he called his elder son Esau and said to him, "My son."
And he answered, "Here I am."
He said, "See, I am old, and I do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me. Then prepare for me savory food, such as I like, and bring it to me to eat, so that I may bless you before I die."
Now Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to his son Esau. So when Esau went to the field to hunt for game and bring it, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, "I heard your father say to your brother Esau,
'Bring me game and prepare for me savory food to eat, that I may bless you before the Lord before I die.'
Now therefore, my son, obey my word as I command you. Go to the flock and get me 2 choice kids, so that I may prepare from them savory food for your father, such as he likes. And you shall take it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies."
But Jacob said to his mother Rebekah, "Look, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I am a man of smooth skin. Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be mocking him, and bring a curse on myself and not a blessing."
His mother said to him, "Let your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my word, and go, get them for me."
So he went and got them and brought them to his mother, and his mother prepared savory food such as his father loved.
Then Rebekah took the best garments of her elder son Esau, which were with her in the house, and put them on her younger son Jacob. And she put the skins of the kids on his hands and on the smooth part of his neck.
Then she handed the savory food and the bread that she had prepared to her son Jacob.
So he went in to his father and said, "My father."
And he said, "Here I am. Who are you, my son?"
Jacob said to his father, "I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Now sit up and eat of my game, so that you may bless me."
But Isaac said to his son, "How is it that you have found it so quickly, my son?"
He answered, "Because the Lord your God has granted me success."
Then Isaac said to Jacob, "Come near that I may feel you, my son, to know whether you are really my son Esau or not."
So Jacob went up to his father Isaac, who felt him, and said,
"The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau."
He did not recognize him, because his hands were hairy like his brother Esau's hands. So he blessed him.
He said, "Are you really my son Esau?"
He answered, "I am."
Then he said, "Bring it to me, that I may eat of my son's game and bless you."
So he brought it to him, and he ate, and he brought him wine, and he drank.
Then his father Isaac said to him, "Come near and kiss me, my son."
So he came near and kissed him, and he smelled the smell of his garments and blessed him.
Isaac said, "Ah, the smell of my son is like the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and wine. Let peoples serve you, and the nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you."
As soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, when Jacob had scarcely gone out from the presence of his father Isaac, his brother Esau came in from hunting.
He also prepared savory food and brought it to his father.
And he said to his father, "Let my father sit up and eat of his son's game, so that you may bless me."
His father Isaac said to him, "Who are you?"
He answered, I am your firstborn son, Esau.
Then Isaac trembled violently and said, Who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me? And I ate it all before you came, and I have blessed him. Yes, and blessed he shall be.
When Esau heard his father's words, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry, and said to his father, Bless me also, father.
But he said, Your brother came deceitfully, and he has taken away your blessing.
Esau said, Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and look, now he has taken away my blessing. Then he said, Have you not reserved a blessing for me?
Isaac answered Esau, I have already made him your lord, and I have given him all his brothers as servants, and with grain and wine I have sustained him. What then can I do for you, my son?
Esau said to his father, Have you only one blessing, father? Bless me also, father. And Esau lifted up his voice and wept.
Then his father Isaac answered him, See, away from the fatness of the earth shall your home be, and away from the dew of heaven on high. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. But when you break loose, you shall break his yoke from your neck.
Now Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, The days of mourning for my father are approaching. Then I will kill my brother Jacob.
But the words of her elder son Esau were told to Rebekah. So she sent and called her younger son Jacob and said to him, Your brother Esau is consoling himself by planning to kill you. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice. Flee at once to my brother Laban in Haran and stay with him for a while, until your brother's fury turns away, until your brother's anger against you turns away, and he forgets what you have done to him. Then I will send and bring you back from there. Why should I lose both of you in one day? Holy wisdom, holy word. Thanks be to God.
Well, I love this story. I love this story for so many reasons. I think I love this story first because it's fun to look at it a little bit critically, right? I mean, poor Isaac, on the one hand. Isaac is this son who is foretold for chapters and chapters and chapters, and then when he's born, there aren't really many stories about Isaac, except for the one time when his dad almost sacrificed him to God, and then this story where he just kind of looks like a doofus. I mean, really, was he really not going to know that it was Jacob tricking him? I mean, come on, it's really hard not to think of Isaac as sort of this fool in this story. But it's also fun to look at this story when you suspend your disbelief, when you read the story kind of on the story's own terms, because it is so rich. It is so well crafted. It's so well timed. Just as Jacob is walking out, that is when Esau is walking in. And speaking of Esau, poor Esau, right? We read this story as people of the book, as having this Judeo-Christian heritage where Jacob is the favorite son, where Jacob is the one of blessing. But when we read this story, we can't help feel for Esau. We can't help feel for Esau, who has been tricked not once, but twice in this story. And God just sort of lets him get away with it. But this story on its own terms is also rich because it engages all of the different senses. It's been interpreted in art, it's been interpreted in drama and analyzed so many different times because it engages the sight. You have Isaac's lack of sight. You have taste, that word savory that appears over and over again, the taste of the food. You have sound, the voice of Jacob and Esau, Jacob trying to change his voice so that it sounds like Esau, but still Isaac recognizing that the voice is the voice of his son Jacob. You have touch, the touch of his skin, which is hairy like the son Esau. And then you also have smell, the smell of, and the fragrance of the food and the fragrance of the skins. It engages all of the different senses. Now, normally when we look at this story, we see it kind of in the vein of the origin story of Jacob as this trickster. Jacob tricks Esau first out of his birthright by taking advantage of Esau when he is hungry and gives him a plate of stew in exchange for his birthright. Then he tricks Esau again here and tricks Isaac here in order to gain Isaac's blessing. And this comes as just the prologue to Jacob becoming this trickster who gets his comeuppance from his uncle Laban, when he is tricked by his uncle into marrying not just the younger, prettier daughter Rachel, but also the older daughter Leah. But I think if you go back and read this story again, if you're looking at it as an origin story for Jacob's trickery, for Jacob's cunning, it has to start with Rebekah. It has to start with Rebekah. We have been sort of trained to read this story through the lens of the men. But really, Jacob is just sort of the innocent accomplice in this story. If you look back in Genesis chapter 25, when Jacob and Esau are born, there is an oracle of God, a message from the Lord, which is given not to Isaac, but to Rebekah. Rebekah is told that there are two nations in her womb, that she is going to give birth to two boys, to twins, to two nations, and that the younger is going to supplant the older, that the younger is going to be God's chosen. Now, this is contrary to the traditional laws of primogeniture that would make the older the blessed son. And so you think of Rebekah having this in her mind when all of a sudden she hears that Isaac is about to bless Esau. In other words, Isaac is about to go against the plan that God has for the family that only Rebekah knows. And so Rebekah sees herself as God's agent. Rebekah takes it upon herself to make sure that God's will comes to pass. He says, Isaac is about to bless your brother, and so I've made a plan, Jacob. We've got to make sure that God's will is done, and so this is how we are going to do it. Rebekah is the one with the agency. Rebekah is the trickster into whose footsteps Jacob himself walks. And continuing this theme of cunning, of practicality, of trickery, the early church fathers might say that even extended to Jesus. That Jesus was the ultimate prankster. That Jesus was the ultimate trickster, because God became human in the form of Jesus and tempted Satan. That Satan took this bait of God as human, took him down into hell, and it was there that the trap was sprung. That surprise, God through Jesus played a joke on Satan, and Jesus was not merely human at all, but Satan had taken God, the infinite almighty God, down into hell so that God could defeat Satan from within, could defeat Satan on his own turf. And in this way, Jesus is following in the footsteps of Jacob and in the footsteps of Rebekah. That extends with the theme of the women's agency also extends into the time of Jesus. There are many feminist biblical interpreters and feminist biblical theologians who look at the stories not just of Jacob and Esau, but also of Sarah and Hagar as having all sorts of agency, having all sorts of power, even within this patriarchal system, as those who are chosen by God to achieve God's plan. It falls in line with this theme of God choosing the weak, God choosing the younger brother, God using the small to shame the mighty. And Jesus, of course, falls into those same footsteps. Jesus, the one who associates with women, who names women, who chooses to befriend women and even take women as his disciples. Jesus, the one like Jacob, who is peaceful, who takes a more domestic role in the home, overturning again the cultural and sexual stereotypes and roles of his age. And so, this, above all else, is an origin story. This is the origin story of Israel. Jacob, of course, will go on to have his name changed to Israel, will become synonymous with the nation and the people of Israel. The Israel that God will claim as God's own people, which again will overturn cultural assumptions of patriarchy. And so we can't help but read this story without reading Israel whenever we hear Jacob in this story. This is the story of someone who their motives are not really given lots of judgment in this story. It's not presented as either good or bad. There are other stories in Genesis and other stories in the Old Testament in general where there is heavy editorializing when all of a sudden so-and-so did wicked in the eyes of the Lord. This is not editorialized as wicked or righteous. It just is. It is just honest. And so I think for us in this modern age, it causes us to ask, how do we understand our origin stories? Do you have an origin story for your family? Do you have an origin story for your marriage? Do you have an origin story for your congregation? Is it told with heavy editorializing through someone's sin or someone's exceeding righteousness? I would suggest that the stories we tell about ourselves and about our origins have tremendous, tremendous power to shape whether we see ourselves through a lens of shame, whether we see ourselves through a lens of blessing, whether we see ourselves as people who are strong and mighty and powerful and who have been entrusted with power in order to promote the good of the weak, or whether we see ourselves as small and scrappy and resilient, using our wits to do what God wills for us. What role does God's will play in our origin stories? What role does human agency play in your family's origin story? I think it is so interesting to go back and read this story and read other stories in Genesis without kind of the theological lens that we get from Romans, right? Where everything is kind of predetermined by God, and God is the overarching force driving all of those events. In Genesis, God may have a plan, but it is certainly going to be up to human scrappiness and human decisions to bring that plan to fruition. You can interpret much of the Bible as God having to deviate from an original plan because the human agents didn't always do their part. As we think about our own origin stories, as we think about our congregation's origin story in this pivotal moment of endings and beginnings of Westminster Presbyterian Church, I think it will be crucial to pay attention to the ways we talk about the things that happen at Westminster Presbyterian Church in the weeks to come. The ways that we describe our waiting for a new pastor. The ways that we talk about our relationship with our community. The ways that we talk about the relationships with one another. Because we are writing an origin story. We are writing a new origin story right now. As this campus and this congregation decides to do a new thing, decides to be a community, not just of faith, but a community of neighbors, where Christ's will is done, where God's way is proclaimed and enacted, amidst diverse faiths, amidst diverse peoples. I came across a family that is looking to reimagine their own origin story as I was preparing this sermon. The story of Wallace Kennedy. She is the granddaughter of George Wallace, that famous Alabama governor who became synonymous with Jim Crow, and his famous quotation of segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. as he stood in the way to prevent the first African American students, James Hood and Vivian Malone, from attending the University of Alabama. Wallace Kennedy, George Wallace's granddaughter, has felt saddled with this legacy, has felt saddled with the shame of this origin story. I read an NPR story about her wrestling with this legacy, wrestling with her father's name. She goes on to point out that her grandfather, in private, actually met with James Hood and with Vivian Malone. He softened his stance in his older age. He asked for forgiveness. He called James Hood a person of great courage. He called Vivian Malone a titan of the civil rights movement. And according to Wallace Kennedy, her grandfather received forgiveness. But that was not enough for Wallace Kennedy. She knew that no matter what she said as the granddaughter of George Wallace, the people, the public, were only ever going to see him as this man synonymous with the evil of racism and the evil of Jim Crow. So rather than become bitter, she has taken it upon herself to become an agent of racial reconciliation. She describes how difficult it is to have conversations about race, how uncomfortable it is, especially in the South, to try to explore those feelings of shame and everything that is bound up in our own cultural and familial origin stories. But she does it out of a sense of righteousness, out of a sense of God's will and God's purpose for her life. To tell her own family's origin story in a new way. Out of the hope, she says, that her grandchildren will be known not as the great-great-grandchildren of George Wallace, but as the grandchildren of Wallace Kennedy. Friends, we are in such a pivotal moment, not just as a congregation, but as a nation, as a people, as we look back at the stories that we tell about ourselves and realize our own agency to tell our stories in a new way, to write our stories so that we can be the ones who enact God's way of reconciliation, God's way of justice, and God's way of peace. Glory be to God the Creator, Christ the Redeemer, and the Spirit the Sustainer.